there's a resurgence. I don't know if you're aware of this, but there's a certain movement in the church. There's some very popular priests out there who are teaching from the perspective of the moral manuals, and people have asked me my opinion of what some of these priests are saying. And I finally gave a listen to some of these talks, and it's so disturbing that they're basically reading out of the moral manuals, trying to teach people morality from this rigoristic, legalistic, faulty anthropology that is it's not just cringeworthy, it's misleading people. Mm-hmm. Talk about this whole small t tradition of the moral manuals and how we got there and how we get out, is there hope?
So, we talked about how the gospel patristic fathers, St. Thomas, began with the question of desire, happiness, and how morality fits within that. And we'll talk a little bit about law, because law had a completely different notion. It wasn't some sort of imposed upon us by God, who is a lawgiver. But as we're going to see, law is actually something beautiful. It's actually linked to wisdom within that sense. And it's a wisdom about, what really will satisfy, what is the path that will get us to return to the Father, which is the whole purpose of why we're created in His image, but to be with Him forever in heaven.
And to participate in His eternal ecstasy of life-giving love.
Right, yeah, and that's what the wisdom, that's why law is almost synonymous with wisdom, at least as the Catechism says.
Right.
What shifted here was the idea really kind of accepting, perhaps not even realizing it, what Occam was saying, that law just simply issues from the will of the lawgiver. It gets even stranger. There's not even necessarily a reason why God gives the law. It's almost like a divine whim, according if you read this, which is even more bizarre, because it's not really linked to anything that's good. It doesn't link wisdom. It's simply God says so, we have to follow. So there's a tremendous shift that occurred then as manuals, and the manuals really were produced at a time in which we had seminaries for the first time in the United States. So Trent saw the problem of the church's the failures of the church and how it needed reform. It really addressed this by really training priests better. So St. Charles Borromeo, as one of the great implementers of Trent, helped establish the seminary system. We need books to train priests.
Right.
And so the modern manuals began to be formed. But while it was drawing upon the great traditions, it also was being influenced by this new idea of freedom and anthropology.
A faulty anthropology.
Faulty, right, where we're kind of equal to our freedom. So whereas, at least in the greater tradition, there was a focus on not just simply desire and the wisdom of the law, but also by our actions, we become something more or beautiful. It's called virtues, moral excellence, virtues. It became more of a focus on, all right, what are the laws that we have to obey? Essentially, they became concretized, how far is too far manuals that would catalog sins, would catalog the law, as a way of focusing on this is what morality is all about. Virtue became the predominant virtue. If you see the development, is not faith, hope, and love, but rather it's obedience.
Yeah, here's the law, follow it.
Because that's all morality was.
And there's no room for why is that the law?
There was no room for why, because often there was no why. God simply said you had to do it, and you had to do it.
And that's all that coming from Occam's understanding of who God is.
It's kind of like logically kind of felt. And if you examine this, and this is where Father Pencaris is so useful, when he examines the development of these, you see more and more reduction of virtue being talked about. You see a reduction of these things. There's the treatise on happiness is thrown out. And you see more and more a focus on a catalog of sins, a catalog of laws. And it gets to the point where this is what kind of defines morality. It's really how far is too far. What can and cannot do. So the hot dog example is great because it tells you this has affected us up to this time.
Oh, mercy.
I come back from Rome, and my first semester in the fall, when I came back in 2009, it was a pretty big class. It was fundamental moral theology. And to my chagrin and terror, one of my students who was an auditor was Father John Murphy, who was a former vicar general for our diocese, vicar for clergy, a giant in the seminary, someone that you're kind of intimidated about.
Right.
So I'm like...
And you had to teach him.
Oh, I'm like, come on. No, he's the gentlest man, a great man. In fact, Father Murphy just died a few months ago. He lived a very long life. He just passed away. But he would sit there front row, and he'd line up all his old books, But it ended up being a blessing, because he was actually intrigued by it, because what the theology he got as a priest in our seminary back in the 50s was from the manual tradition.
Yeah,
so, and he had all the manuals lined up in Latin. He had a few English versions. And at one point when I was talking about manual theology and the approach and all this, and we were going through the book, he raised his hand. I'm like, oh no, I hope he's not going to totally smash me, or, how could you doubt this? He's like, Joseph, I agree with this assessment of how lacking this is, and how happy I'm returning to the patristic fathers and Augustine and Thomas. He just first thanked me. I'm like, oh, thank goodness, I'm okay. At least off the hook. He says, let me give you an example. He said, when I was a student in seminary.
So an example of the how far is too far moral manual approach.
Yeah, like what he studied. He said, I forgot who his professor was of moral theology in our seminary in Cleveland. This is back in the 50s. He said that they spent almost an entire class on the issue of, he called the hot dog. So this is, I couldn't believe this. So I didn't know this either, because prior to the Second Vatican Council, you could not eat meat
on Friday throughout the year.
The whole year, not just Lent, right? So the great moral dilemma presented was Fridays during the fall, all right? So
high school football games.
High school football games, you're at the stadium. So you're there, it's not just Cleveland, we're a wild football town, but it's everywhere. So you go to the stadium, and there you are. As a Catholic, you're tempted, because they're rolling away is the hot dog. So he said they began the question of like, okay, so if someone were to buy a hot dog, a Catholic, and they were to proceed to eat the hot dog on a Friday when the law said they couldn't, to what degree or how much of the hot dog would they eat before it goes from venial to mortal? Or maybe the whole thing is mortal. And what happened was, he said it was like over 2-hour conversation with the professor about debating. Well, some of the rigorists would say, even smelling the hot dog, you're going to hell, But then you had the lax seminarians. Well, you can eat most of it, or maybe just the whole thing, it's all venial. Some say one bite's venial, and they came to this agreement that, well, as long as you ate less than half, which actually kind of sounds like it's an equiprobabilism, but less than half, you're in sin, but you're not going to hell if you die on the way home.
Right.
And
But if you ate
the jumbo hot dog, that was I'm like, didn't everyone think about the jumbo hot dog? But they didn't. So
the idea that
this dominated, by the way, a whole class in seminary. But you see the logic of it. How far is too far? Yeah. What's the law?
So, it could come if with that whole mentality, it's like, okay, venial sin, venial sin, venial sin. Oh, you're about to eat more than half the hot dog. Yep. Now it's mortal. Right here's the mortal sin part. When you apply that paradigm to life, and we all know moral questions are of utmost seriousness,
right,
for our destiny. But it's not merely because we're breaking a rule of an arbitrary God.
Right.
It's because we have a destiny, and there is. I remember years ago I was listening to a moral theologian who put it this way. He said, "If there's no destiny, there's no such thing as morality." And I thought about it. I was like, "Oh, that's quite interesting." Yeah, if there's no destiny, there's no morality. For example, pick the nearest Starbucks to your rectory, wherever you live.
Oh yeah, it's right down the highway.
Okay,
right
so if your destiny is that Starbucks, and you walk out your front door and walk in the opposite direction, someone could rightly say to you, "You're going the wrong way."
Right.
Right? If that Starbucks was your destiny. But if there's no destiny, if you're just going for a random walk, it makes no sense for somebody to say to you, "You're going the wrong way." Mm-hmm. What do you mean I'm going the wrong way? I'm just going out for a random walk. No, there is a destiny here, and I love that the word destiny is an archer's term.
Right.
It means to aim at, right? And I love this too. The word Torah, law, is also an archer's term, which means to hit the mark.
Right.
And then, of course, sin is an archer's term, to miss the mark.
Right, which would be hamartia in the Greek. The Christian notion of sin is hamartia, missing the mark.
Missing the mark.
Yeah, it always bespeaks going in a particular direction. And this is also the brilliance of St. Thomas and the Catechism, because it's not just a question of happiness, but happiness is always linked to our end. So there's always keeping in mind, not just that we came from God, but we're returning to God. And how do you return to him? And this goes back to the question of law. Law is not some arbitrary whim by some sort of, despot God who wants us to be miserable, but rather it's giving us a wisdom to say, right, this is the way to which that you need to direct your heart, your longings, your happiness, because this is the only way by which your heart's desires are going to be fulfilled, that you will be in union with God forever. Law then provides that wisdom. It's not a negative thing. It's not an oppressive thing. It's certainly not the product of a God who is a legislator that wants us to be unhappy. But as the Catechism says, it's a form of fatherly wisdom. It directs us. Father Giertek, who is a theologian, a papal theologian in Rome, uses an example I use with the students that's almost like a signpost, right? You don't focus on the signpost, but signposts are important. And you use the example going to the Starbucks, right?
Right.
Because it directs us. If you want to go this direction, that's the way you go.
That's the way you go, right.
For I said, the amber alert signs we have in Cleveland not only give you amber alerts, but also bridge out on I-90.
Yes.
It warns us, if you go in this way, you're going to be falling into the Cuyahoga River, go a different way. And this is a much more richer and positive sense of law.
Yes.
It's a father who wants to teach us the ways by which we're created, and this is, again, where he wants to direct us towards our ultimate happiness, which is his desire.
So let me just clarify this for those viewing. When you and I talk about the problematic nature of the moral manuals, we're not saying that the problem is with God's law.
No, not at all.
Not at all. Christ says it better than anybody, of course.
Yeah.
Think not that I've come to abolish the law. I've not come to abolish the law. I've come to fulfill the law. But it seems to me that approach, that rigoristic legalism of the moral manuals, how much of the hot dog can you eat before it's a mortal sin? Well, and you're a little out there, well, just eat half of the jumbo hot dog.
Or even a third. You're getting more hot dog than a regular.
Right. So it shows the nonsensicalness of the legalism. Fulfillment of the law is synonymous in Paul's language with freedom from the law, which is not a freedom to break the law. It's the freedom to fulfill it because you have no desire to break it. And the example I'll give to my students, I'll pick on a married couple and I'll say, Bill, do you have any desire to murder your wife, Joanne? Everybody laughs. He says, no, of course. I said, do you need the commandment, thou shalt not murder thy wife? No, I don't need that commandment. Right. You're free from the law. Free not to break it, free to fulfill it because you have no desire to break it. And then I'll turn to Joanne and I'll say, Joanne, have you ever seen Bill pounding his fist saying, who are those old celibate men in Rome who tell me I can't murder my wife? What do they know about marriage anyway? And everybody laughs. But the point is this, I say, yeah, of course your husband's not bitter towards the church's teaching that you're not supposed to murder your wife. Why? Because we're only bitter towards the law when we desire to break it, right? Christ came not to shove these rules down our throats. He came to transform us inwardly so we would no longer need the law, so that we could fulfill the law. And I'll say to my students that, if you want a sure norm for where you need to grow interiorly, just ask yourself this question: which laws do I still need? Right? Paul says, thank God the law is there because I would not have known I was going in the wrong direction. And here I love Augustine again. The law was given so that grace might be sought, and grace was given so the law might be fulfilled. So many Christians in my experience, and you tell me your experience, Father, these are decent Catholics who want to do the right thing. They go to Mass on Sunday. They want to be a good Catholic. But they're still in the Old Testament. They're thinking, I have to pull myself up by my bootstraps and be a good little boy or a good little girl and check the box, rather than falling on our knees and saying, I see what the law calls me to. I see my inability to do it. But Lord, I open to your grace and your mercy. Please come to me, come inwardly and transform me by your grace. I mean, if we don't have that, we're still stuck in the Old Testament.
Yeah, and the transformation piece is important, and that's what's good. I agree with you. Being stuck on a sense of simply morality equals law or the negative prohibitions is the problem. It's not the law itself,
not the law
it's not
itself,
the Ten
right.
Commandments itself.
Right.
In fact, there is an essential way in terms of walking the Christian life where, especially with children, we should absolutely teach our kids the Ten Commandments.
Yes, yes.
I'm not anti-Ten Commandments. No one's,
Of course
Christians
not.
are not. But what we see is, and I agree with what you're saying, and the language in terms of we use of morals, so to take what you said and place it within a moral standpoint is that it's the first step. You got to learn the game. I mentioned
Yes.
in class.
Yeah, you had great examples, sport examples
Yeah.
and music examples.
So like discipline and law, when you first begin learning a sport, that's an essential point in that journey. That journey, as we'll call the moral life, back to the Father. However, if we stay there, and that's the problem is if you see law as something that's simply extrinsic, that blocks me, that's against me, that's where we stay sort of stagnant. We don't take the next step, which is essential, which is that full appropriation of what's the good and wisdom that's in that law. And what we believe is that's what's called virtue, that we're called to act in certain ways, but as we do so, and we do it authentically with our freedom, that it becomes more second nature to us, that we actually not only are used to doing the good, but this is a dense metaphysics here, that we actually become good.
Yes.
We become good. So this is the transformation you're talking about, is kind of how the language of moral theology talks about virtue, which is not just simply our freedom. It's not, like you said, picking ourselves up, but it's God who is also acting with our freedom to transform us that we may be good. And that's why watching a T-ball game is a lot different than watching a baseball game of my high school nephews. Or when you start seeing professional sports where there's a real excellence. They don't think about, as you would say, dribbling. LeBron doesn't think about going outside bounds because playing has become so second nature. This is an analogy for
virtue.
For virtue. And that's exactly, unfortunately, what has not been stressed by the manual tradition was those virtues. And so a lot of this is reclaiming what, again, Augustine and Ambrose and Thomas and the Gospels, this is reclaiming the greater, wider, beautiful vision of what moral theology is.